Miguel Sanders stared at the school hallway as if it were a gauntlet he had to cross every single day. The sound of lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking on polished floors, and muffled laughter filled the air. But to him, every chuckle felt like it was aimed at his back. At 15 years old, Miguel was an introverted teen with a knack for hiding in the shadows. His broad shoulders and soft frame made him a frequent target for cruel jokes. His quiet demeanor only made it worse. He never fought back, and they all knew it. "Hey, tortoise," a voice rang out, piercing through the cacophony of chatter. Miguel didn't need to turn to know it was Jackson Miller, the school's golden boy. Jackson was everything Miguel wasn't. Tall, athletic, and effortlessly confident. He was the captain of the football team, and wherever he went, a pack of loyal followers wasn't far behind. Miguel quickened his pace, clutching the strap of his worn-out backpack as though it could shield him from the humiliation that was about to follow. "Where are you running off to, Sanders? Don't turtles move slow?" Jackson jeered, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby students. Miguel's cheeks burned, but he kept walking. Laughter erupted around him, echoing in his ears like a taunt he couldn't escape. The worst part wasn't the laughter. It was the way everyone watched. Some smirked, others looked away, pretending not to notice, but none of them ever stood up for him. Miguel hated it. He hated the way he felt invisible and exposed all at once. That afternoon, things escalated further during gym class. Coach Davidson, a burly man with a booming voice, had announced a timed lap around the track. Miguel could feel his classmates' eyes on him before he even took his first step. "All right, Sanders, let's see if you can actually finish this time," Jackson sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. His friends laughed, slapping him on the back as though he'd said the cleverest thing in the world. Miguel bit his lip and focused on the track ahead. His heart pounded as he started running, his feet thudding heavily against the asphalt. The voices followed him, a relentless wave of whispers and laughter. His legs felt like lead after the first 100 meters, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. And then it happened. His foot caught the edge of a raised patch of asphalt, and he stumbled. Time seemed to slow as his arms flailed, desperately trying to regain balance, but gravity won. He hit the ground hard, scraping his palms and knees on the unforgiving surface. The laughter was instant and deafening. "Nice one, tortoise. Slow and steady, right?" Jackson's voice boomed over the others, and Miguel didn't even bother looking up. He stayed there for a moment, his hands trembling as humiliation surged through him. Later that day, Miguel sat alone in his room, the faint hum of his computer filling the silence. The video had already been uploaded to social media. Someone had caught his fall on camera, and now it was circulating under the caption, "The Sanders Shuffle." The comments were brutal. Miguel slammed his laptop shut and buried his face in his hands. He felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of their words and the image of his failure replaying over and over in his mind. That evening, his mother, Sarah, knocked softly on his door. She was a kind woman with tired eyes, her hair often tied back in a messy bun after long shifts as a nurse. She walked in, carrying a plate of sandwiches, and set it on his desk. "You've hardly eaten all day," she said gently, sitting on the edge of his bed. "I'm fine," Miguel mumbled, not meeting her eyes. Sarah sighed, her gaze softening as she reached out to touch his shoulder. "Miguel, I know something's bothering you. Talk to me." He hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "They don't see me, Mum. They see a joke, just this big, stupid joke." His voice cracked, and he blinked rapidly, trying to fight back the tears. "Oh, honey." Sarah pulled him into a hug, holding him tightly. "You are not a joke. You are kind, smart, and so much stronger than you think." Miguel wanted to believe her, but the voices of Jackson and his friends echoed too loudly in his head. The following weekend, Miguel decided to go for a walk in the park to clear his mind. It was a crisp autumn morning, the air cool against his skin as he trudged along the winding paths. He kept his hood up, not wanting to risk running into anyone he knew. As he rounded a bend, he heard the sharp sound of a whistle. Curious, he followed the noise and found a small group of kids running laps around a track under the watchful eye of an older man. The man's voice was firm but encouraging as he called out instructions. "Keep your form steady, don't give up on yourself." Miguel watched from a distance, mesmerized. The man's presence was commanding yet warm, and the way the kids responded to him made Miguel feel something he hadn't in a long time: hope. The man must have noticed him standing there because he waved Miguel over. "You look like you've got something on your mind," the man said, his tone friendly but direct. Miguel hesitated before shuffling closer. "I was just watching. I'm not much of a runner." The man raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Well, everyone starts somewhere. Name's Joe Thompson, used to coach track back in the day." Miguel introduced himself, his voice barely above a whisper. Joe studied him for a moment, then said, "Tell you what, Miguel, why don't you give it a try? 1 lap, no one's watching but me." Miguel wanted to decline, but there was something about Joe's demeanor that made it hard to say no. He stepped onto the track, his heart pounding as he started to jog. His strides were uneven, his breathing labored, but he didn't stop. When he finally crossed the line, Joe clapped him on the back. "Not bad, kid. Not bad at all." For the first time in what felt like forever, Miguel felt a flicker of pride. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Miguel returned to the park the next morning, unsure of what exactly had compelled him to do so. Maybe it was the way Joe had spoken to him, treating him like he was capable of more than just being a target for ridicule. Or maybe it was the faint spark of pride he had felt after completing that single lap, something he hadn't felt in years. Whatever the reason, he stood at the edge of the track again, his hands shoved deep into his hoodie pockets as he watched Joe work with the younger runners. Joe noticed him almost immediately and waved him over with a grin. "You're back. That's a good sign," he said. Miguel shrugged, his shoulders stiff. "I figured I'd see if I could try again." Joe's grin widened. "That's the spirit. All right, Miguel, let's see what you got today. 1 lap, just like yesterday. But this time, try to pace yourself. Don't rush. Find a rhythm." Miguel nodded, stepping onto the track. His heart was already racing, but he focused on Joe's instructions. He started jogging, his strides awkward but determined. His lungs burned halfway through, and his legs felt like they were made of lead. But he kept going. When he crossed the line, Joe gave him a firm nod of approval. "Better," Joe said. "You're fighting through it, and that's what counts." Miguel felt a small swell of pride, but it was quickly dampened by the memory of Jackson and his friends. He glanced down at his shoes, scuffed and worn from years of use. "It's not enough, though," he muttered. "No matter how hard I try, they'll always see me the same way." Joe's expression softened. "Kid, let me tell you something. People are always going to talk. They'll always have opinions. The question is, are you going to let their words define you, or are you going to show them who you really are?" Miguel didn't respond, but the words lingered in his mind long after he left the park. Over the next week, Miguel continued to meet Joe at the track every afternoon. Each session was grueling, pushing Miguel to his limits in ways he hadn't expected. Joe introduced new drills, focusing on building Miguel's endurance and improving his form. "Head up, Miguel," Joe barked during one session. "You can't see where you're going if you're staring at your feet." Miguel obeyed, lifting his chin and fixing his gaze on the track ahead. It felt strange at first, but he quickly realized that it made a difference. With his head up, he could see the progress he was making, even if it was just a few more steps each day. Despite the progress, Miguel still struggled with self-doubt. One evening, after a particularly difficult session, he slumped onto a bench, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. "What's the point, Joe? Even if I get better, I'll never be like them, like Jackson." Joe sat down beside him, his tone calm but firm. "Why would you want to be like him?" You're not here to compete with Jackson or anyone else. You're here for you, to prove to yourself that you can do this. Miguel frowned, staring down at his hands. But what if I can't? What if I just fail? Joe leaned forward, his voice steady. Then you get back up and try again. That's what life is, Miguel. Getting up every time you fall. And let me tell you something. The fact that you're even out here putting in the work, that already makes you stronger than most people. Those words stayed with Miguel as he left the park that night. At school, however, things were as cruel as ever. Jackson and his friends hadn't let up, and the rumor mill churned with whispers about Miguel's attempts at running. Sanders thinks he's going to be an athlete now, Jackson said one day in the cafeteria, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Maybe if they add a snail race to the Olympics, he'll have a shot. The laughter that followed cut through Miguel like a knife. He clenched his fists, his appetite vanishing as he stared down at his untouched lunch tray. That evening, Miguel confided in his mom. "Why do they hate me so much?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked at him with a mixture of sadness and determination. "They don't hate you, Miguel. They're just afraid of anyone who's different. But you can't let their fear stop you from being who you are. You're stronger than you think." Her words gave Miguel a small sense of comfort, but the fear of failure still lingered. One Saturday morning, Joe introduced Miguel to a new challenge: hill sprints. The steep incline of the hill loomed before him like a mountain, and Miguel's stomach churned with anxiety. "This is going to hurt," Joe said matter-of-factly, "but it'll make you stronger. Ready?" Miguel wasn't, but he nodded anyway. The first sprint was brutal, his legs burning with every step. By the time he reached the top, he was gasping for air, his chest heaving. "Again!" Joe called from the bottom of the hill. Miguel groaned but turned around and ran back down, his legs trembling. He repeated the sprint again and again, each one feeling harder than the last. By the end, he collapsed onto the grass, his entire body aching. Joe crouched beside him, handing him a bottle of water. "That's what it takes, Miguel, pushing past the pain. You've got more in you than you realize." Miguel stared up at the sky, his chest rising and falling as he caught his breath. For the first time, he started to believe Joe's words. Maybe he did have more in him. Maybe he was capable of more than he'd ever imagined. As the weeks went on, Miguel's body began to change. His movements grew more fluid, his endurance improved, and his frame became leaner and stronger. The weight he carried, both physical and emotional, began to lighten. His old hoodie, once tight around his torso, now hung loosely on his shoulders. Even his face looked different, the roundness giving way to sharper features. But the biggest change wasn't in his appearance, it was in his confidence. For the first time in years, Miguel walked with his head held high, his strides purposeful. He still wasn't sure if he was ready to face Jackson and the others, but he was beginning to realize that their words didn't define him. At the park, Joe noticed the transformation and grinned. "Look at you, kid. You're becoming a runner." Miguel smiled for the first time in weeks, a genuine, unguarded smile. "Thanks, Joe, for everything." Joe clapped him on the back. "Don't thank me yet. The real work is just beginning." Miguel nodded, his determination stronger than ever. For the first time, he believed that maybe, just maybe, he could prove them all wrong. Miguel's confidence was slowly growing, but the weight of the constant ridicule at school lingered. His transformation was undeniable. He had shed some of his bulk and replaced it with lean muscle. His face had sharpened, his arms felt stronger, and even the way he moved carried more purpose. Still, the halls of Jefferson High School were as merciless as ever. No one seemed to notice the changes, except to twist them into something cruel. "Look who's trying to be a tough guy now," Jackson taunted one day as Miguel walked past his table in the cafeteria. His voice was loud, dripping with sarcasm. "What's next, Sanders? Gonna join the track team?" Oh wait, they'd never let you in. Miguel hesitated for a split second, feeling the familiar pull to look down and shrink into himself. But something stopped him. He straightened his back and walked past without a word. Inside, though, his stomach churned. The laughter from Jackson's friends followed him all the way out of the cafeteria. That evening, Miguel's frustration boiled over during his training. With Joe, they were running interval sprints, and Miguel pushed harder than ever, his feet pounding against the pavement like he was trying to escape something. "Easy, kid! You're gonna wear yourself out!" Joe shouted, but Miguel didn't. "Slow down." When he finally came to a stop, his chest heaving, he slammed his hands onto his knees and let out a frustrated yell. Joe approached him cautiously. "All right, what's going on?" Miguel shook his head, his breaths ragged. It doesn't matter how hard I try. At school, I'm still just the same joke to them. They don't care if I'm different now." Joe folded his arms, his expression stern. "And you care too much about what they think. Miguel, those kids don't define you. Hell, they don't even know you. What matters is what you think about yourself." Miguel looked up at him, his face flushed. "But how do I stop caring? How do I just ignore it?" Joe sighed, leaning on his knee. "You don't ignore it. You use it. Every word they throw at you, every laugh, every insult, you take it and turn it into fuel. Let it push you forward. Let it make you stronger. Because at the end of the day, it's not about them. It's about you." The words stuck with Miguel, even as he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. Maybe Joe was right. Maybe he needed to stop running from the pain and start running towards something bigger than Jackson's insults or anyone else's expectations. The next morning, Miguel woke up with a renewed determination. When he arrived at the park, Joe greeted him with a grin that Miguel was beginning to recognize as pride. "All right, today's the day," Joe said, clapping his hands. Miguel frowned. "The day for what?" "The long run," Joe replied. 5 miles, no breaks." Miguel's eyes widened. He had never run more than 2 miles in a single session. 5? Are you serious?" Joe nodded. "Dead serious. You're ready for this, Miguel. You just don't know it yet." Miguel hesitated for a moment, then nodded. If Joe believed he could do it, then maybe he could. The first mile was smooth. His legs carried him forward with an ease that surprised him. By the second mile, his breathing grew heavier, and by the third, his muscles started to ache. By the 4th mile, doubt began to creep in. His mind screamed at him to stop, to rest, to give up. But then Joe's voice echoed in his head. "Let it push you forward. Let it make you stronger." Miguel gritted his teeth and kept going, his steps steady despite the burn in his legs. When he finally crossed the imaginary finish line, he collapsed onto the grass, his chest heaving, but his heart soaring. Joe crouched beside him, a bottle of water in hand. "What did I tell you? You had it in you all along," Miguel managed. A weak smile. For the first time, he felt like he was starting to believe it. Back at school, the whispers about Miguel's transformation were growing louder. His classmates noticed the way his clothes fit differently, the way his shoulders squared, the way he no longer slouched when he walked. Even Jackson seemed to notice, though he masked his surprise with sarcasm. One afternoon, as Miguel was leaving the gym, Jackson intercepted him near the locker room. "Hey, Sanders," he said, his tone more curious than mocking. "What's with the rocky routine? You think you're gonna take me down or something?" Miguel stared at him for a moment, then replied, "I'm not doing this for you, Jackson." His voice was steady, firm. "I'm doing it for me." For the first time, Jackson didn't have a comeback. Miguel walked away, his heart pounding, not from fear, but from something else. For the first time, he felt like he had taken back a little bit of control. That evening, Joe introduced Miguel to a new challenge, resistance training. They worked with weighted vests and uphill sprints, pushing Miguel's body to its limits. Each session was harder than the last, but Miguel embraced the pain. It wasn't just physical. It was a reminder of how far he had come and how far he could still go. As the weeks passed, Miguel's transformation became impossible to ignore. His once round face now had defined cheekbones, his arms were lean and strong, and his legs carried him with an energy he had never felt before. Even his posture had changed. He walked taller with a confidence that was no longer just an act. One evening, as he finished a particularly grueling session, Joe handed him a flyer. "What's this?" Miguel asked, squinting at the paper. "The Jefferson High annual track meet," Joe said. "It's in 2 months. I think you're ready." Miguel stared at the flyer, his heart racing. The thought of competing, of putting himself out there in front of everyone, was terrifying. But then he thought of Jackson, of the laughter, of all the times he had felt small and powerless. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady. "I'm in," Joe grinned. "Good, because we've got a lot of work to do." As Miguel walked home that night, the flyer tucked into his pocket, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He wasn't just running anymore, he was chasing something, and for the first time he believed he might actually catch it. The flyer for the Jefferson High annual track meet became a constant reminder of the challenge ahead. Miguel taped it to his bedroom wall, right above his desk, where he could see it every day. At first, the sight of it made his stomach churn. With nerves, competing in front of his entire school, including Jackson and the rest of the football team, felt like stepping onto a battlefield unarmed. But as the weeks went on, the flyer became something else, a source of motivation. It was no longer about proving them wrong, it was about proving himself right. Joe wasted no time ramping up Miguel's training. The sessions grew longer and more intense, incorporating endurance runs, speed intervals, and even strength training with resistance bands and medicine balls. Miguel's muscles ached constantly, but he welcomed the pain as proof of his progress. One evening, after an especially grueling session, Miguel collapsed onto the grass, drenched in sweat. His legs felt like jelly, and his chest heaved as he gulped down water. Joe crouched beside him, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're ready for this, kid?" Joe said, his tone confident. Miguel shook his head, wiping sweat from his brow. "It doesn't feel like it. What if I freeze out there? What if I mess up?" Joe rested a hand on Miguel's shoulder. "You're going to feel scared. That's normal. But fear doesn't mean you're not ready. It just means it matters. To you. And I've seen you push through things most people would have quit. Trust me, Miguel, you've got this." Those words stayed with Miguel, echoing in his mind during the long nights when doubt crept in. His reflection in the mirror was almost unrecognizable now. His once round face was sharper, his jawline more defined. The extra weight he'd carried for years had melted away, leaving behind a lean, strong frame. His arms and legs had a muscular tone he never thought he'd achieve, and even his posture had changed. He stood taller now, his shoulders squared, exuding a quiet confidence. But despite the changes, Miguel still felt the weight of Jackson's shadow looming over him. At school, Jackson's taunts continued, though they carried a hint of something different now, something almost like insecurity. "You really think you can compete with me, Sanders?" Jackson sneered one afternoon near the lockers. "You're out of your league." Miguel paused, meeting Jackson's gaze for the first time without flinching. "We'll see," he replied calmly before walking away. Jackson's smirk faltered, and for a brief moment Miguel saw something he hadn't expected: doubt. As the track meet approached, Miguel's resolve was tested in new ways. One day during training, Joe introduced Miguel to starting blocks, the device used to launch runners at the start of a race. Miguel struggled to get the technique right, his movements clumsy and awkward. "Push off with power, Miguel," Joe called out as Miguel stumbled for the 5th time. "I'm trying." Miguel snapped, frustration bubbling over. Joe raised an eyebrow but remained calm. Trying isn't enough. You need to focus. Clear your mind. Stop thinking about everything else. Just feel it. Miguel took a deep breath, resetting himself. This time, he closed his eyes for a moment before stepping into the blocks. He focused on the tension in his legs, the weight in his arms, the rhythm of his breathing. When Joe blew the whistle, Miguel exploded forward, his movements fluid and powerful. "That's it!" Joe shouted, clapping. "That's what I'm talking about!" Miguel smiled, the frustration melting away. He was getting better, stronger. At home, Sarah noticed the changes in her son, both physically and emotionally. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, she placed a hand over his. "I'm so proud of you, Miguel," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've come so far." Miguel looked down at his plate, a small smile playing on his lips. "Thanks, Mom, it's just... I want to make sure it's worth it." Sarah squeezed his hand gently. "It's already worth it, honey. Because it's not about them. It's about you, and you've already won no matter what happens at that meet." The day of the track meet arrived faster than Miguel expected. The school's athletic field buzzed with energy as students, parents, and faculty filled the stands. Miguel stood near the starting line, his heart pounding as he surveyed the competition. Jackson was there, of course, his cocky grin firmly in place. Miguel's palms were sweaty as he adjusted his shoes, the nerves threatening to overwhelm him. But then he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Joe, his expression calm and steady. "Breathe, Miguel," Joe said. "You've put in the work. Now it's time to show them what you're made of." Miguel nodded, taking a deep breath. He glanced toward the stands and spotted Sarah, her face beaming with pride. Beside her sat Emily, holding up a handmade sign that read, "Run, Miguel, run!" He couldn't help but smile. As the runners took their positions on the starting line, Miguel crouched into the blocks, his muscles coiled like springs. The crowd fell silent as the official raised the starting gun. "On your marks, get set!" The gunshot cracked through the air, and Miguel surged forward, his legs pumping with a power he hadn't known he possessed. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about Jackson or the crowd or the laughter. He wasn't running away from anything. He was running towards something, and it felt like freedom. Miguel's heart pounded in sync with his steps as he bolted down the track, the roar of the crowd a distant hum in his ears. His focus was razor-sharp, every thought honed in on the rhythmic pounding of his feet against the ground. The crisp air filled his lungs, fueling his muscles as they burned with effort. For the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the eyes on him. He embraced them. At the first bend of the 400-meter dash, Miguel could sense Jackson's presence nearby. The taller boy's strides were smooth and powerful, his form near, perfect as he pulled ahead by just a few paces. But Miguel didn't let it shake him. Joe's voice echoed in his mind, steady and firm. "Run your race, Miguel. Don't let anyone pull you out of your rhythm." Miguel held his pace, his breathing steady and controlled, even as the lactic acid built in his legs. By the second turn, the gap between him and Jackson had narrowed, but a sharp thought cut through his concentration. What if he couldn't sustain this? What if he pushed too hard and fell short? The doubts threatened to creep in, but Miguel fought them off. He thought about the months of sweat, pain, and perseverance that had brought him to this moment. He thought about the insults, the laughter, and the feeling of being invisible. None of that mattered now. What mattered was that he had shown up and he was still running. The straightaway ahead stretched long and unrelenting. Jackson was still leading, his form unchanged. But Miguel noticed something. His arms weren't swinging with the same ease. His shoulders were tightening ever so slightly, and his breathing seemed heavier. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Miguel to see it as a crack in Jackson's armor. Pushing harder, Miguel leaned into his stride, pumping his arms with renewed determination. The cheers from the crowd grew louder as the gap between them began to close. He didn't dare glance to his left or right. His eyes were locked on the finish line. As they entered the final turn, Miguel's muscles screamed in protest, his body begging him to slow down. He clenched his jaw and dug deep, remembering Joe's advice from their toughest training sessions. The pain is temporary. The finish line isn't. The last 50 meters were a blur of adrenaline and raw determination. Miguel and Jackson were neck and neck now, their feet pounding in perfect rhythm. Miguel could feel Jackson glance at him, the surprise evident in his opponent's movement. For a split second, it felt like time slowed, the noise of the crowd fading into a dull roar. Then Miguel surged forward, every ounce of strength and willpower pouring into his final strides. He felt his body strain against the limits he once thought unbreakable, his arms pumping like pistons as the finish line loomed closer. He crossed it. The sound of the crowd exploded around him, deafening and chaotic, but Miguel didn't process any of it. His chest heaved as he stumbled to a stop, his legs wobbling beneath him. He bent over, hands on his knees, and gasped for air, his mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. A whistle blew, and the official results were announced. Over the speakers, first place Miguel Sanders. Miguel's head snapped up, disbelief washing over him. He had done it. He had actually won. His legs nearly gave out as the weight of the moment hit him, but then he felt a pair of hands steadying him. "Kid, you did it," Joe said, his voice thick with emotion as he clapped Miguel on the back. "You just proved every single one of them wrong." Miguel turned to see Joe's face, pride radiating from the older man's expression. He managed a shaky smile, tears stinging his eyes as he nodded. He scanned the crowd and spotted his mom standing in the front row of the bleachers, her hands covering her mouth as tears streamed down her cheeks. Beside her, Emily waved her sign, frantically, her grin wide enough to light up the entire field. Before he could move toward them, Jackson approached, his usual cocky smirk nowhere to be seen. For the first time, Miguel saw something different in Jackson's eyes. Respect. "Congrats, Sanders," Jackson said, extending a hand. "You earned it." Miguel hesitated for a moment before taking Jackson's hand. Their grip was firm, and though no more words were exchanged, the gesture spoke volumes. As the crowd continued to cheer, Miguel made his way to his mum, who pulled him into a tight hug the moment he reached her. "I'm so proud of you," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "You've always been my champion." Miguel held her close, the overwhelming mix of pride, relief, and joy, making it impossible to speak. That night, as Miguel lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he replayed the race in his mind. He thought about every step, every doubt he had overcome, and every moment of pain that had led him here. For the first time, he felt truly at peace with himself. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. The days following the race felt surreal for Miguel. At school, the usual stares and whispers were different now. Instead of mocking grins or snickers, he saw nods of acknowledgement and even a few pats on the back. For the first time in his life, he wasn't walking the hallways as a shadow. He was Miguel Sanders, the guy who beat Jackson Miller. As he opened his locker one morning, Emily appeared by his side, camera in hand, and a grin plastered across her face. "So, Mr. Track Star, how does it feel to be the talk of Jefferson?" "I?" Miguel chuckled, still adjusting to the attention. "Weird, definitely weird." Emily leaned against the lockers, studying him thoughtfully. "You deserve it, you know, all of it. You worked harder than anyone I've ever seen." Miguel felt his face heat up, but he managed to smile. "Thanks, Emily. But it wasn't just me. You, Joe, my mom. I wouldn't have made it without you." "Guys." "Sure," Emily said, snapping a quick photo of him. "But you were the one on that track. Don't forget that." Their conversation was interrupted by a familiar voice. "Hey, Sanders." Miguel turned to see Jackson standing a few feet away. The memory of their handshake after the race came rushing back, and for a brief moment, Miguel braced himself for another jab. But Jackson's expression wasn't smug or condescending. It was neutral. "Listen," Jackson started, scratching the back of his neck. "About everything. I was a jerk, a massive one, and I just wanted to say I'm sorry for all of it." Miguel blinked, stunned. Of all the things he'd imagined Jackson might say, this wasn't one of them. "Thanks," Miguel said after a pause. "I appreciate that." Jackson nodded awkwardly before walking away, leaving Miguel and Emily in stunned silence. "Well," Emily said, breaking the tension, "didn't see that coming." "Me neither," Miguel admitted, shutting his locker. "But I guess people can surprise you." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of changes. Miguel kept up his training with Joe, though their sessions were less grueling now that the pressure of competition had eased. His newfound love for running wasn't just about proving a point anymore. It had become part of who he was. One afternoon, Joe handed Miguel a worn-out medal from his coaching days. "What's this?" Miguel asked, turning the medal over in his hands. Joe smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's the first medal I ever won as a coach. I want you to have it. Consider it a reminder of where you started and how far you've come." Miguel felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at the medal. "Thanks, Joe, for everything." "You earned it, kid," Joe said, clapping him on the shoulder, "and don't you ever forget it." At home, Sarah surprised Miguel with a framed photo of him crossing the finish line at the track meet. "Emily gave me this," she explained, her smile radiant. "I thought it deserved a place on the wall." Miguel stared at the photo, the moment frozen in time. The determination on his face, the crowd cheering in the background, it all felt like a dream. As he hung the photo in his room, Miguel realized how much had changed. He wasn't the same boy who had stumbled on the track and been laughed at by his peers. He had faced his fears, pushed past his limits, and discovered a strength he never knew he had. But the most important change wasn't physical. It was the confidence that now coursed through him, the belief that he could face whatever challenges came his way. One evening, as Miguel jogged through the park, he noticed a boy sitting alone on a bench, his shoulders hunched in defeat. The sight stopped Miguel in his tracks, memories of his own struggles flooding back. He approached the boy cautiously. "Hey," Miguel said, his tone gentle. "You okay?" The boy looked up, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Yeah, just trying to figure some stuff out." Miguel nodded, understanding. "You know, I used to sit on that same bench, thought I couldn't do anything right, but I was wrong." The boy's eyes widened. "Really? What changed?" Miguel smiled. "I started running, not away from things, but toward them. It helped me figure out who I am. Maybe it could help you too." The boy considered this for a moment before nodding slowly. As Miguel jogged away, he felt a sense of purpose settle over him. His journey wasn't just about proving himself anymore. It was about helping others see their own potential, just like Joe had done for him. For Miguel Sanders, the finish line wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something bigger.
If you enjoyed the story and want to see more content like this, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications.